Good morning, guys. So this is, I noticed yesterday I didn't really give an introduction. This is my channel. Um, I'm not really intending this to do much of anything. I just want to share whatever I want to share when I want to share it. So I'm going to continue the book I started reading yesterday. Again, it's called Embracing the Light by Betty J Eadie. And we will continue where we left off. Oops. The second day. Fix that a little. Okay. Morning came quickly, with the sunlight sneaking around the edges of the curtains. The surgery was scheduled for noon. I could either wake up and wait for hours, or I can enjoy the luxury of sleeping in. I was still groggy from the sleeping pill, or perhaps I was exhausted from my fear and anxiety of the night before. Now, with the morning light brightening the room, I relaxed and began to reflect on the last time I had been in the hospital. My fears of the previous night had been slight compared to my fears then. At least this time, I knew what was supposed to happen. Joe retired from the Air Force in 1967, and we had looked at the many options open to him in a new civilian career. Computers were becoming a new industry in themselves, and his training qualified him to begin a new career just about anywhere he wanted. All we had to decide was which side of the country we wanted to live on. We finally chose to move to the Pacific Northwest, where Joe could take a position at a large aerospace corporation. We felt that the climate would be a welcome contrast to the hot, dry weather we had become accustomed to in Texas. Also, we would be able to live near my father and his wife, who now lived in the Northwest. Shortly after moving there, I became pregnant with our seventh child. This was not the kind of surprise we wanted. Feeling that we had all the children we could properly care for, 5 children living, we had taken precautions to prevent another pregnancy. My 6 previous pregnancies had weakened my body, and the doctors had discouraged me from having another child. In the 3rd month, I began experiencing severe cramping and bleeding. The doctors told me that I was passing fetal tissue. Because of this and other complications, they were sure that I would miscarry soon. I was admitted to the hospital for a week as the bleeding continued. We waited for my body to dispose of the damaged fetus naturally. Soon it became apparent that the pregnancy was not going to terminate, and one of the doctors suggested that I consider aborting it. He believed that the baby, if carried to term, would most likely be born with parts of its body missing. I had no reason to doubt him. After discussing it with Joe, we decided to undergo the surgery. The day before the scheduled abortion, I was in the hospital to be examined by another team of doctors, and they were in agreement that we should continue as planned. Just as the last doctor passed by me to leave the room, he said, "We don't understand why that little fellow is hanging in there." I felt a chill pass through me, and the thought came to me, don't do this. You must have this child. He wants to be born. Um, I'm in a very, or I am a very emotional person, and I bawled through this book the first time, so just be understanding. I will probably cry through a lot of portions of it, but I will continue on. He wants to be born. When Joe came to visit me at the hospital that evening, I explained what the doctors had said and told him about my impressions that this child should be born. We talked about going ahead with the pregnancy and having a deformed child. Neither of us wanted to do it, but I knew I couldn't live with myself if I aborted the child now. Joe agreed that we had to keep it, and we met later that night with the doctors and explained our feelings. They were adamant we must abort the damaged fetus. They said that no doctor would approve the continuation of the pregnancy and that they certainly wouldn't be a part of it. I was discharged from the hospital the next day and began looking for a doctor who would accept me on my terms. I finally found a young doctor who had just begun his private practice after spending several years in the Air Force. He felt a kinship with Joe because of their common background and agreed to take me on as a patient. He saw some possibility that the baby might live, but he too was afraid that it would be born deformed. He put me to bed and gave me a list of orders to follow. Joe and the kids were great in filling in for me around the house, and I used the time to take some home study courses and finish my high school education. As the months flew by and we rapidly approached my due date, I became increasingly frightened. We prepared the children for the likely outcome that the baby would be born, either deformed, possibly with parts of its body missing, or it could die. Joe and I tried to comfort each other by recalling often my impressions upon hearing the doctor's words, "This little fellow is still hanging in there." This was during the times when hospitals didn't allow fathers in delivery rooms, and the thought of facing this child's birth without Joe near me was terrifying. Though the hospital staff agreed to let Joe stay with me during the delivery, they were apprehensive about Joe's possible reaction to it. They told him that if he fainted or became ill during the experience, that the first responsibility would be to me. He was asked to sign a waiver that exempted them from liability for him. Labor began, and I entered the hospital on June 19th, 1968. I was so frightened that my body shook uncontrollably. Excuse me. Joe stood by me in the delivery room, holding my hand and stroking my head. He had to wear a green gown and white mask like all the doctors. His gray blue eyes tried to comfort me, but I could tell by the puffing in and out of the mask that he was as terrified as I was. As delivery approached, we tightly clutched hands. As the baby was born, I watched the doctor's eye. I knew immediately that our months of fear and anguish had been in vain. He laid the baby on my stomach so I could hold it, and Joe and I quickly looked it over from head to toe. We began crying. Our son was as perfect and healthy as any baby ever born, and I knew as I held him that indeed this baby was meant to come to me, and that it did very much want to be born. Although I would not have changed my decision for anything, the pregnancy took a toll on my body. Over the next few years, a multitude of problems developed, and my doctor suggested that I have a hysterectomy. After thoughtfully considering it and discussing it with Joe, I decided to go along with the doctor's recommendation, and the date for my surgery was set. Now, the morning of the surgery, a new nurse came in and prodded me awake. She wanted to give me a shot to put me back to sleep in preparation for the surgery. I was amused as she was waking me up to put me back to sleep. I probably would have laughed, but I was already feeling the drug working through my veins with its warmth spreading throughout my body. The doctor must have come in about then because I heard his voice say, "Is she ready?" And everything quietly became black. It was afternoon before I regained some awareness. My doctor was standing by me, saying that the surgery had been a success and that I should be feeling fine shortly. And I remember thinking to myself, this is great. Now I can finally get some rest and stop worrying about the surgery. And I fell back to sleep. That night I awoke and looked around me. Although I was in a semi-private room, I was alone. The other bed was empty. The room was cheerfully decorated with bright striped orange and yellow wallpaper. Loud, I thought, but cheerful. I noticed 2 nightstands, 2 closets, a television set, and a large window near my bed. I had asked for a window because ever since my childhood I had suffered from claustrophobia. It was dark outside, and the only light in the room was the nightlight over the sink by the door. I rang for the nurse and asked for some water. She said I had been given ice chips since earlier that morning, or that afternoon, but I had no recollection of getting any. And she said that my husband and some friends had been in and visited with me, but I couldn't recall seeing them. I was conscious of the fact, however, that my makeup was a mess and that I really didn't appreciate anybody seeing me when I didn't know about it. And then there was my gown. As I looked down, I realized it covered only the bare essentials. I would have to talk to Joe about bringing his friends around. At 9 o'clock, the nurse brought my evening medication. Except for a little pain from the surgery, I felt fine. I took the pills and settled down to watch a little television before sleeping. I must have dozed off because when I looked at the clock again, it was 9:30, and I was suddenly feeling lightheaded and had the sudden urge to call Joe. I found the phone and somehow managed to dial him. I do not remember the conversation. I was becoming so tired that all I wanted to do was sleep. I managed to turn off the television set, then pull the blanket up under my neck. I was beginning to feel chilled to my bones and weaker than I had ever felt before. My death. Again, I must have dozed for a while, but not for long because the clock still seemed to say 9:30. Then suddenly I woke up with the strangest feeling. Somehow my instincts warned me of impending danger. I looked around the room. The door had been pulled half closed. The dimmed light was still on over the small sink by the door. I felt myself become keenly alert and growing with fear. My senses told me that I was alone, and I could feel my body become weaker and weaker. I reached for the cord near the bed in an attempt to call the nurse, but try as I might, I could not bring myself to move. I felt a terrible sinking sensation, like the very last drops of blood were being drained from me. I heard a soft buzzing sound in my head and continued to sink until I felt my body become still and lifeless. Then I felt a surge of energy. It was almost as if I felt a pop or release inside me, and my spirit was suddenly drawn out through my chest and pulled upward as if by a giant magnet. My first impression that I was free. There was nothing unnatural about the experience. I was above the bed, hovering near the ceiling. My sense of freedom was limitless, and it seemed as if I had done this before, or I had done this forever. I turned and saw a body lying on the bed. I was curious about who it was, and immediately began descending towards it. Having worked as an LPN, I knew well the appearance of a dead body, and as I got closer to the face, I knew at once that it was lifeless. And then I recognized that it was my own, that was my body on the bed. I wasn't taken aback, and I wasn't frightened. I simply felt a sympathy for it. It appeared younger and prettier than I remembered, and now it was dead. It was as if I had taken off a used garment and had put it aside forever, which was sad, because it was still good. There was still a lot of use left in it. I realized that I had never seen myself three-dimensionally before. I had only seen myself in the mirror, which is only a flat surface, but the eyes of the spirit see in more dimensions than the eyes of the mortal body. I saw my body from all directions at once, from in front, behind, and from the sides. I saw aspects to my feature I had never known before, adding a wholeness, a completeness to my view. This may be why I didn't recognize myself at first. My new body was weightless and extremely mobile. I was fascinated by this new state of being. Although I had felt pain from the surgery only moments before, I now felt no discomfort at all. I was whole in every way, perfect. And I thought, this is who I really am. My attention went back to the body. I realized that nobody was aware that I had died, and I felt an urgency to tell someone I'm dead, I thought, and no one is here to know it. But before I could move, 3 men suddenly appeared at my side. They wore beautiful light brown robes, and one of them had a hood on the back of his head. Each wore a gold braided belt that was tied about the waist with the ends hanging down. A kind of glow emanated from them, but not unusually bright. And then I realized that a soft glow came from my own body, and that our lights had merged together around us. I was not afraid. The men appeared to be about 70 or 80 years old, but I knew somehow that they were on a time scale different than ours. The impression came to me that they were much older than 70 or 80 years old, that they were ancient. I sensed in them great spirituality, knowledge, and wisdom. I believe they appeared to me in robes to evoke the impression of these virtues. I began to think of them as monks, mostly because of the robes, and I knew that I could trust them. They spoke to me. They had been with me for eternity, they said. I didn't fully understand this. I had a difficult time comprehending the concept of eternity, let alone eternities. Eternity to me had always been in the future, but these beings said they had been with me for eternities in the past. This was more difficult to comprehend. Then I began to see images in my mind of time long ago, of an existence before my life on earth, of my relationship with these men before. As these scenes unfolded in my mind, I knew that we had indeed known each other for eternities, and I became excited. The fact of a pre-earth life crystallized in my mind, and I saw that death was actually a rebirth into a greater life of understanding and knowledge that stretched forward and backwards through time. And I knew that these were my choicest friends in the greater life and that they had chosen to be with me. They explained that they, with others, had been my guardian angels during my life on earth. But I felt these three were special, that they were also my ministering angels. They said that I had died prematurely. They somehow communicated a feeling of peace and told me not to worry, that everything would be all right. As this feeling came to me, I sensed their deep love and concern. These feelings and other thoughts were communicated from spirit to spirit, from intelligence to intelligence. At first, I thought that they were using their mouths, but this was because I was used to people speaking. They communicated much more rapidly and completely in a manner they referred to as pure knowledge. The closest word in English we would have to define it is telepathy, but even that doesn't describe the full process. I felt their emotions and intents. I felt their love. I experienced their feelings. And this filled me with joy because they loved me so much. My earlier language, the language of my body, was truly limited, and I realized that my former ability to express feelings had been almost non existent compared with the ability of the spirit to communicate in this pure way. There were many things that they wanted to share with me and that I wanted to share with them, but we all knew that the concerns of the moment took precedence. And I suddenly thought of my husband and children and was worried as how my death would affect them. Excuse me. How could my husband care for 6 children? How would the children get along without me? I needed to see them again, at least to satisfy my own concerns. My only thought was to leave the hospital and go to my family. After so many years of waiting for a family, of working to keep my family together, I was afraid that now I would lose them, or perhaps I was afraid that they would lose me. Immediately, I began to look for an exit, and I spotted the window. I quickly went through it, and I emerged outside. Soon I would learn that I didn't need to use the window, that I could have left the room at any point. It was only because of my lingering thoughts, and therefore limitations, of mortality that I thought of using the window. It occurred to me that I was in a slow moving mode, because I still thought in terms of having a physical body, when in fact my spiritual body could move through anything that had been solid to me before. The window had been closed the whole time. My trip home was a blur. I began moving at tremendous speed. Now that I realized I could, and I was only vaguely aware of the trees rushing below me, I made no decisions, gave myself no directions, just thought of home and knew I was going there. Within a moment, I was at my house and found myself entering the living room. I saw my husband sitting in his favorite armchair, reading the newspaper. I saw my children running up and down the stairs and knew they were supposed to be getting ready for bed. 2 of them were in a pillow fight, actually normal bedtime procedure for our children. I had no desire to communicate with them, but I was concerned about their lives without me. As I watched them individually, a preview of sorts ran through my mind about them, enabling me to see ahead into each of their lives. I came to know that each of my children was on earth for their own experiences, that although I had thought of them as mine, I had been mistaken. They were individual spirits like myself, with an intelligence that was developed before their lives on earth. Each one had their own free will to live their life as they chose. I knew that this free will should not be denied them. They had only been placed in my care. Although I don't recall them now, I knew that my children had their own life agendas and that when they had completed them, they too would end their stay on earth. I foresaw some of their challenges and difficulties, but knew that these would be necessary for their growth. There was no need for sorrow or fear. In the end, each of my children would be all right, and I knew that it would only be a brief moment before we were all together again. I felt bathed in serenity. My husband and my precious children, this family I had waited so long for, would be all right, and I knew that they could go on. And so then, could I? I was grateful for this understanding and felt I was allowed to reach it so that my transition through death would be easier. Now I became filled with the desire to move on with my own life and to experience all that awaited me. I was drawn back to the hospital, but I don't remember the trip. It seemed to happen instantaneously. I saw my body still lying on the bed, about 2.5 feet below me, and slightly to my left. My 3 friends were still there waiting for me. Again, I felt their love and the joy they felt in helping me. As I was filled with their love, somehow I knew that it was time for me to move on. I also knew my dear friends, the monks, would not be going with me. I began to hear a rushing sound. When you are in the presence of enormous energy, you know it. I knew it now. A deep, rumbling, rushing sound began to fill the room. I sensed the power behind it, a movement that seemed unrelenting. But although the sound and power were awesome, I was filled again with a very pleasant feeling, almost hypnotic. I heard chimes or distant bells tinkling in the background, a beautiful sound I'll never forget. Darkness began to surround my being. The bed, the light by the door, the entire room seemed to dim, and immediately I was gently drawn up and into a great whirling black mass. I felt as if I had been swallowed up by an enormous tornado. I could see nothing but the intense, almost tangible darkness. The darkness was more than a lack of light. It was a dense blackness, unlike anything I had known before. Common sense told me that I should have been terrified, but all the fears of my youth should have risen up. But within this black mass, I felt a profoundly pleasant sense of well-being and calmness. I felt myself moving forward through it, and the whirling sound became fainter. I was in a reclining position, moving feet first, head slightly raised. The speed became so incredible that I felt that light years could not measure it. But the peace and tranquility also increased. I felt that I could have stayed in this wonderful state forever, and knew that if I wanted to, I could. I became aware of other people as well as animals traveling with me, but at a distance. I could not see them, but I sensed that their experience was the same as mine. I felt no personal connection to them and knew that they represented no threat to me, so I soon lost awareness of them. I did sense, however, that there were some who were not moving forward, as I, but were lingering in this wonderful blackness. They either didn't have the desire or simply didn't know how to proceed, but there was no fear. I felt a process of healing take place. Love filled this whirling, moving mass, and I sank more deeply into its warmth and blackness, and rejoiced in my security and peace. I thought, this must be where the valley of the shadow of death is. I had never felt greater tranquility in my life. And that's where we're stopping for this morning. So I hope you really liked it so far. It is a wonderful book, and I will read some more tomorrow. So thank you guys. Again, my name is Annie, and I am reading Embraced by the Light. Thank you. God bless.